I'm going to read from something that Professor Burgess gave me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rowland Brucken. He's a history professor at Norwich University. He specializes in the history of international human rights law and American Cold War foreign policy. Rowland's first book, A Most Reluctant Crusade, The United States, the United Nations, and Human Rights, 1941 to 1953, is under contract for publication by Northern Illinois University Press. This presentation grew out of a recognition that the United Nations, partially due to American obstructionism, is little prepared or willing to systematically prevent, stop, or punish those responsible for the worst of human rights abuses. Therefore, it is often up to victims to articulate processes to punish offenders and lay the basis for recovery, healing, and societal transformation to prevent mass injustice from occurring again. In his free time, Dr. Brucken is a competitive ultramarathoner, as evidenced by the shoes he's wearing today. Husband and proud father of 3 girls, and I'm so impressed that he's come to visit us at Landmark College, and I'm so impressed that you all turned out for this important talk. Let's welcome Dr. Brucken.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want you to give yourselves a hand for being here tonight, too. I want to thank Peter and Jeff and Mihai, the wonderful folks I've met in my short time here. I thank you very much for making me really feel at home. This is a difficult topic to talk about. It's a difficult topic to listen to. The music that you heard was from Thomas Mfumo. Thomas Mfumo, whose picture there I have not met, though I heard him play when he lived in Zimbabwe. He's currently in exile in Seattle, because if you know what's happening in Zimbabwe with Robert Mugabe and the unspeakable suffering that is happening in that country. I did have the enormous honor and opportunity to help his bass player receive political asylum in the United States. I've been a member of Amnesty International for 25 years, and I testify in asylum cases involving Zimbabweans in the United States. And so I got to know Thomas indirectly through his music and through his bass player. It's an honor for me to be associated with him and his freedom songs, some of which you listened to when coming in. I want the focus tonight to be on the victims of human rights abuses, and I wanted to do this in a couple ways. First, with the music. Secondly, to symbolically light this candle. This candle was from the 10th anniversary of a group in Detroit called Save Our Sons and Daughters, or SOSAD. The founder of SOSAD, Clementine Barfield, back in 1987, July 17th, and dates are very important if you've lost loved ones. July 17th, 1986, Derek and Roger Barfield, her sons, were shot in Detroit. Her oldest son, Derek, was killed. Her younger son, Roger, was wounded. And this was, again, in 1987 or 1986. From 1979 to 1986, Detroit was a war zone in the inner city. And in fact, the murder rate in Detroit itself, per capita murder rate, was larger than the 10 other cities that were highest ranked combined. There was basically a bloodletting of the youth of Detroit. She founded, in the aftermath of her son's death and her other son's wounding, a group called SOSAD. And to formulate anti-violence programs within the inner city communities. I met her 10 years later when SOSAD had its 10th anniversary, and I met with her and members of her group in the context of a joint meeting with Amnesty International's unit to abolish capital punishment, and I'm a fervent death penalty opponent. She wanted to meet with us because she wanted to let us know that violence for her was a way of life and that she wanted to reject violence and join with us in rejecting violence done by the state. In this case, the taking of life through capital punishment. So we had a phenomenal conversation about the cost of violence, both violence perpetrated by the state and violence perpetrated by citizens against one another. Finally, I want to read a very brief part of a poem by Zbigniew Herbert. Zbigniew Herbert was a poet in Poland, a dissident during the Cold War. He wrote a phenomenal poem called Mr. Cognito on the Need for Precision. It's part of a larger body of work about Mr. Cognito, this fictional character. And I just want to read part 3 because it speaks to the importance of remembering victims of human rights abuses. Here's part 3 of that poem. Now Mr. Cognito climbs to the highest tottering state of indefiniteness. How difficult it is to establish the names of all those who perished in the struggle with inhuman power. The official statistics reduce their number, once again piteously. They decimate those who have died a violent death, and their bodies disappear in abysmal cellars of large police buildings. Eyewitnesses, blinded by gas, deafened by salvos, by fear and despair, are inclined toward exaggeration. Accidental observers give doubtful figures accompanied by the shameful word, about. And yet in these matters, accuracy is essential. We must not be wrong by a single one. For we are, despite everything, the guardians of our brothers. Ignorance about those who have disappeared undermines the reality of the world. And let me repeat those last two lines. Ignorance about those who have disappeared undermines the reality of the world. And so I became interested in this topic because oftentimes victims of horrific human rights abuses, some of whom I've come to know personally because of my asylum work, have unspeakable stories of suffering. And it's important to honor them as individuals and not with statistics, because each of them has a unique human experience and suffers loss and pain in their own unique ways. So what we're going to look at tonight in that context, though, is to look at something called transitional justice. What can be done in countries that have suffered horrific human rights abuses? And we'll look at what exactly those situations are like, what characteristics they have. And then look at three options that have been used to try to restore some sense of justice and dignity to survivors. We'll look at national and international trials. We'll look at impunity and amnesty, which sounds counterintuitive, right? Amnesty, to give amnesty to those who have committed horrific abuses. And then finally, truth commissions. And we'll come to some conclusions, and I welcome your thoughts and questions afterward. So what kind of societies are we talking about when we talk about transitional justice? Some of you may be familiar with the context of failing or failed states. Somalia is case A in the current world about a failed state. Others are on, if you look at the graph here from Freedom House, they rank states' failure and likelihood of failure. These are states where horrific human rights abuses have the potential for taking place or are taking place. And they're marked by a couple characteristics. One, and this is just a fancy political science term, inability to deliver political goods. These are states marked by governments that cannot provide basic services to their citizens. They can't provide transportation and infrastructure. They can't provide health care. They can't provide roads, airports, infrastructure, sanitation, sewer, because typically of violence and instability. There is endemic and systemic violence. And endemic and systemic are both important, meaning that there are several dynamics going on in these societies. Some of these societies marked by what are called security dilemmas, where you have different groups of armed gangs, militias, paramilitaries, who take up arms because they perceive a danger from another group. And then the first group sees danger in this group forming. And you see a cycle of escalation, of action and reaction among various groups to protect their territory, protect resources, and to commit aggression against other groups identified as their enemies. You also have in this context something called predatory groups, where you have perhaps one group that is more powerful than another group. And they use their power for predation. They might traffic in women, run guns, run drugs, enslave a population for forced labor if they're sitting on a natural resource. So this is what I mean by systemic and endemic violence, fueled by one of mankind's most brilliant inventions, which is the AK-47. The AK-47 shares a number of very important characteristics that mark it as an incredible invention. A child can use it. It is almost indestructible. It is cheap to produce knockoffs. It's easily transportable and deadly. There have been a couple biographies of the AK-47, as if it's a person, if you're interested in this. So arms trafficking, especially in AK-47s, fuel this kind of conflict. In these societies, there's often a strong executive branch. But here's the paradox. We think of dictators, there's a synonym, strong men, right? There aren't many women who are dictators. That says something perhaps about gender and biology. But they are marked that strong. We think of strongmen as strong in power. They're actually oftentimes very weak and paranoid. If you're in power, your duty as you see it is to maintain it. So you tend to see threats everywhere, which means you're likely to act in a very heavy-handed fashion, ruling by decree and committing human rights abuses with those that you have power over, adding to the violence. All this instability leads to economic underdevelopment. And so there are wars over scarce resources. People commit violence against each other simply to have food to survive for their self, their kin group, their ethnic group, their nationality, however groups are broken down in these kind of societies. And finally, people don't think of themselves as members of a state first. They don't think of themselves as Americans. They think of themselves as members of another political unit like a state or a religion or a nationality, and that puts them then at odds with competing groups. Their first loyalty, therefore, is not to a national identity, but to some other subgroup. That fuels this kind of conflict because there's no common identity that can be used to unite people. So it's in these contexts where you see massive human rights abuses, genocide, ethnic cleansing, mass murder, mass rape. These are the kind of societies where this occurs. So the purpose tonight is to see how societies might recover from these abysmal conditions. The thesis that I want to put forward is through situation-appropriate methods, meaning we'll look at amnesties, trials, and truth commissions and see some of the strengths and weaknesses of each model in a theoretical sense, with some practical examples of where they've been tried. So let's look at amnesty and impunity. Again, it seems counterproductive to possibly look at amnesty as a viable solution in some cases. There are some reasons where it's been done and where it even might be appropriate in the short term. One time it's been, in one situation where it's been tried, or type of situation, is where because of what's called domestic jurisdiction, which is a staple of international law, countries are sovereign in their own territorial units. So they can treat citizens historically as they want to, without any external oversight or external obligations. This began to change in the mid-20th century, but this has been a historical reality. Even if law has changed, though, practically, in many cases, states are still sovereign over their own citizens and have nothing to fear from any external oversight. So that in practice, governments have practiced impunity or amnesty because they can, because they don't want to hold supporters accountable for the human rights atrocities that they've committed. But there might be some cases, especially very fragile times of coalitions that have just recently achieved some measure of peace and stability, where doing something like trials or truth commissions might lead to a renewed outbreak of civil war and violence. And so in the short term, we might call this a bargain with the devil. In the short term, it might be appropriate to postpone justice for the sake of stability, not permanently postponing. And in fact, because of some recent international decisions, especially by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, amnesties are illegal if they are used to postpone justice indefinitely or, in the eyes of the justices, for invalid reasons. So in cases in Peru and in Brazil, the Inter-American Court held that amnesties that were passed by legislatures in those two countries were illegal because, this is fascinating, when we just think of it in terms of the language used, because the Inter-American Court said that victims of human rights have a right to truth. A right to truth. They have a right to know what happened to themselves or their loved ones. And an amnesty law, by not providing an avenue for them to find out those answers, is therefore illegal. Now, we know that amnesties can be terribly immoral as well. Imagine having a loved one, especially this happened in Latin America, disappear. Typically in the dead of night, a plainclothes security official would knock on your door, and you would not see your brother, your sister, your father, your mother, your wife again. And you yourself may be brutalized. What are the needs that you have which amnesties cannot meet? After talking with many victims of horrific human rights abuses, I've sort of categorized what victims need with 5 A's. It doesn't matter if you're a victim of a nonviolent crime or a violent crime. If your house has been burglarized, you often have these needs. So one is assurance of safety. That's the first thing that victims of human rights abuse need. Assurance that what happened to them will not happen again. They have some measure of safety. Secondly, answers. They want to ask the offender, if they're a survivor, ask the offender questions. Why did you choose me to assault? Was there something I could have done to prevent it? Because victims often feel guilty, right, that they caused it. They need answers from the offender. Third, they need an audience when they are ready to tell of their pain and suffering. Not on television. A supportive environment where they can relate what happened to them and feel assured that their feelings are valid. Fourth, an apology. Not just, yeah, I'm sorry for doing this. An apology from the offender that states what he or she is apologizing for. And then accountability. The offender must provide restitution or must face some sort of sanction. And amnesty allows for none of this because accountability is postponed. And victims are told, your suffering is not something we have to deal with now. There's a greater good that needs to be met. Therefore, your offender will not be tried or held before a truth commission. So let's look at a second possibility of holding human rights offenders accountable. Trials in national or international courts. There are some advantages of trials. Trials can do some things very, very well. Trials can answer 3 basic questions. Who did it? When did they do it? And how should they be punished? Trials do very good jobs of gathering those facts in general through cross-examination of witnesses. Those are the main parts of the main questions that a trial seeks to answer. Now, this is very important in the context of massive human rights abuses because torture doesn't happen in the public square. It happens inside prisons. It's a hidden human rights abuse. So trials can establish what happened in private through creating a public record. That's very important for documenting exactly what happened. It does no good to say the government of Argentina disappeared perhaps 10,000 people in the 1970s. That doesn't do any good. Who were they? What happened? Who were the guilty? Trials can expose that. Secondly, because human rights abuses happen when the rule of law has been suspended, when security forces have the ability and power to simply work their will against helpless victims. Trials can demonstrate the past is not going to be repeated. We have suffered enough. Now we will create a formal justice system. We will have trials based on evidence, the rule of law, testimony, cross-examination, an unbiased judge and jury, if a jury is involved, so that we make a commitment to not repeating the mistakes of the past. This could be very important. Trials can serve as a deterrent for 2 groups of people. Now, certainly the most obvious deterrent might be offenders, right? If they're put on trial, perhaps future offenders won't commit the same offense. But it also serves as a deterrent to victims to not take the law into their own hands and commit vigilante justice against their former offenders, because we've created a process to hold them accountable. So there won't be revenge killings because there is accountability through trials. And finally, trials might help survivors. Trials give survivors 2 main possibilities. One is to tell their story, to confront their accuser. Now, this is very delicate. Victims of human rights abuses, especially of sexual abuse, don't want to, understandably, confront their accuser in an open court of law. But for victims who are willing and able to do that, a trial can be empowering, to appear before their offender unafraid and tell their story. And trials can also lead to victims recovering some sort of restitution, perhaps a monetary award in a civil trial, perhaps something intangible like a recognition that their offender did something wrong if there's a guilty verdict. Trials can provide survivors with tangible or intangible benefits. But there are serious shortcomings of trials. Now, we in the United States have been raised to believe that a trial is the answer for a wrong. Right? If you feel wronged, you either sue yourself or the state sues on your behalf. Wonderful. Trials do a very good job of answering who, what, where, and how an offender should be punished. But those aren't the only questions out there. Trials have weaknesses. One, what happens in the aftermath of a horrific human rights abuse when offenders are put on trial, but one of two things happen? One, perhaps the trial is a whitewash. In other words, the offender is put on trial and found not guilty because the judge didn't want to find the defendant guilty. So there's the appearance of justice, but not the reality of justice. Or perhaps if a new government is in power and puts people on trial, you've got show trials. You've got just guilty, 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 and people are executed or put in jail without a fair trial. That's the other extreme. So maybe trials aren't the best way to go if either one is going to be the result. In a trial, the focus isn't on the victim. The focus is on the offender. That's the purpose of a trial, is to do something with the offender. The victims often feel like they're a tool in the trial process, that they're being used by the prosecutor to punish the defendant. Trials are all about the defendant, so survivors often feel left out of the process. What happens if the person who assaulted you or killed a member of your family makes a deal with the current government in power? You will get immunity. You will not be punished because we need your testimony. How does that make then victims feel when their offender doesn't face accountability at all? Courts might not be unbiased. They might face interference from the current government in power, who tells judges to act a certain way. Judges themselves might be corrupt and take money or other favors from various groups whom they're supposed to be prosecuting. So trials might not be fair at all. And finally, offenders might not be available to prosecute. What happens if offenders have fled to another country and the other country where they are refuses to send them back for trial? Or what if there are too many offenders? In the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, there were perhaps 100,000, 150,000 offenders, people who committed, men, women, children, who committed murder, rape, arson, other kinds of property destruction, assault. What do you do with 150,000 offenders? What if, as again as in Rwanda, the entire court system is destroyed? The pre-genocide court system, the judges are either now guilty of genocide or were killed themselves. There's no judiciary alive. Or what if there's no money in the aftermath of a genocide for a new government to spend on prosecuting those accountable? We've got a problem if trials are our only option for holding offenders accountable. Which has led, in the 1990s, mid-1990s, another way to hold offenders accountable. Now, actually, the earliest Truth Commission was back in 1982, but nobody really paid attention to it because it was in Chad, of all places. How many folks have been exposed to Truth Commissions? Have you heard anything about? What's the most famous one? South Africa, right? South Africa, that's the most, following apartheid. They called their Truth Commission the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is both a strength and a weakness, as we'll see, to promise reconciliation. Be careful what you promise as a result of a Truth Commission. Well, Truth Commissions, according to Patricia Hayner, who wrote a book about 21 of them around the world. Let's be clear about what a Truth Commission is. Truth Commission has a couple characteristics. First, similar to a trial, It focuses on human rights abuses that were committed in secret in the past. So the job of a truth commission, just like a trial, is to bring these atrocities to the surface, to uncover the hidden history, in the case of South Africa, of apartheid, of racial separatism, and who participated. The goal, in the words of Alex Bahrain, who is the deputy director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, is to look at 4 different kinds of truth. And I mentioned this sounds kind of technical, but to show where it overlaps with trials and where it separates. The first kind of truth Bahrain calls factual or forensic truth. It's the who, what, when, where, the same kind of information that a trial is designed to elicit. But truth commissions also focus on 3 other kinds of truth. Second kind of truth that Bahrain identifies is a personal or narrative truth. In other words, truth commissions allow victims to explain their stories without being interrupted and cross-examined. You've got 10 minutes, tell us all that happened to you. We won't interrupt, we're going to listen, we're going to take notes, tell us what you want what you want to say. So there's a personal and narrative truth. A third kind of truth that Alex Bahrain talked about for a truth commission is social truth. A trial is just based on deciding what this offender did and didn't do. Truth commissions want to explain the whole context of a human rights abuse. So for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the subject was apartheid in general. It wasn't about P.W. Botha, who was the last leader of pre-apartheid South Africa before F.W. de Klerk. It wasn't about P.W. Botha's role, if he's the defendant. It was about society, the collective experience of apartheid through the eyes and mouths of individual victims. So a much wider purpose than a single trial of an individual. And finally, Bahrain says truth commissions want to uncover what he called healing and restorative truth. They just don't want victims to testify. They want to give victims something in return for testifying. So the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, made sure that victims were allowed to say what they wanted. Now you may think, well, if victims are asked, well, what do I want from my pain and suffering? I want money. No. Very few people who testified before the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission wanted money. They wanted gravestones for their relatives who had died. They wanted a school or a park named after their loved one. They wanted some sort of memorial published in a book about what happened to their loved one. They wanted intangibles. Money wasn't good. Money was immaterial to them. Money's not going to make them feel better. So it was the heartbreaking stories of people who had nothing, poverty, who testified before the TRC and said, I just want a gravestone for my husband. That would make me whole. A second characteristic. A trial, again, is just focused on an individual defendant, what he or she did. A truth commission wants to investigate a whole range of human rights abuses over a time period. Now, here's where truth commissions get political. Truth commissions, all 21 truth commissions, have a mandate. They are only supposed to investigate certain types of crimes committed within certain kinds of dates, committed by certain kinds of people. So you want to open a can of worms. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The government of South Africa had to decide, well, we're certainly going to investigate crimes committed by apartheid officials, but should the Truth Commission also investigate crimes committed by the African National Congress, the liberation movement in South Africa? Wow. And the ANC said, absolutely not, because our crimes were, if we committed any crimes, they were committed for the greater good to destroy apartheid. Right? And the South African government under Mandela said no. The Truth Commission will hear crimes committed by the ANC and by the apartheid South African government. Other governments, though, try to limit the range of abuses. For example, in Bolivia and Paraguay, the Truth Commissions were not allowed to report on allegations of torture or illegal detention. only actual killings committed by security forces in those countries. Michael Ignatieff, who's a wonderful writer, he said this about truth commissions in terms of investigating a pattern of abuses. He said, quote, "The past as an argument and function of truth commissions, like the function of honest historians, is simply to purify the argument, to narrow the range of permissible lies." We like to think of truth commissions as finding the truth, right? They're supposed to investigate a pattern of abuses and tell the truth. How many of you all study history? Good. See, I'm a historian, right? How many of you all think there is one way to describe a certain event in the past that we could all agree on? Right? There's truth, right? In terms of interpretation. No? Good. They're teaching you well here. Excellent. Great. So truth commissions, by saying they're truth commissions, argue that we're going to produce the truth, but no, as Michael Ignatieff said, the purpose is really to narrow the range of permissible lies. I like that, right? It's a good, cynical, but realistic view. Third, truth commissions are temporary. They're not supposed to last long term. As soon as they publish a report, they go out of existence. So in their mandate, it will say this truth commission will exist for 2 years. It will have this power. For example, maybe it can subpoena public officials. Maybe it can't. Maybe it can name names and report. Maybe it can't. All of these things are bundled into the mandate. So it's only supposed to be temporary. And the purpose of this report is very, very important, because once a report is published, it's harder for future generations to deny what happened. Oh, the Holocaust didn't happen. Or if it did, perhaps there's only 100,000 Jews who were killed. Right? We have Holocaust deniers here in the United States and Europe. Truth commissions their report operates the same way, to prevent deniability, to establish a historical record. One Rwandan government official was asked if he wanted to remember or forget the genocide that killed 17 members of his immediate family in a report. He said, quote, he said this very well, he said, "We must remember what happened in order to keep it from happening again. But we must forget the feelings, the emotions that go with it. It is only by forgetting that we're able to move on." Now that's an interesting juxtaposition of remembering in the report, but forgetting the emotional intensity that goes with it. That's very difficult. The report also allows victims and survivors to discover information, especially about their loved ones. But hearing this kind of information can be traumatizing, right? Imagine that a close friend of yours was disappeared, and now you have the chance to know exactly what happened to him. Would you want to know? Elizabeth Hashi, who's the wife of a political activist who disappeared in South Africa in the 1980s, found out that her husband had been kidnapped and killed by the security forces, who roasted his body over a fire for 6 hours before dumping it into the Fish River. Now that's what she found out about her husband, and this is what she said about that. She said, quote, "At least I know a bit of the story. It's better to know how they killed him." There might be a lot of people who wouldn't want to know the details. Finally, a report can allow victims and survivors to tell the commission about their own hardships. And this can be pretty cathartic for some folks. Lucas Baba Sikpieri told the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, he said, quote, "I feel what has been making me sick all the time is the fact that I couldn't tell my story. But now it feels like I got my sight back coming here and telling you this story," that then becomes part of the report. Reverend S.K. Mbande, who's now a minister in the post-apartheid government in South Africa, he said this, and this is fascinating when you think about what this quotation means. He said, quote, and he was asked about, well, how do victims feel? Testifying in front of the Truth Commission, he said this. He said, quote, "After telling their story, they relax. They've said what's in their hearts, what was closed up, and they often say they feel much better. It's true that the Truth Commission is a healing process. If not 100%, then 60%. And then the interviewer asked him, well, what do you mean by 60%? Do you mean that 60% of those who testify are healed? Or those who testify are healed 60%? And he said, quote, "Perhaps 60% feel better, but those people are healed only 60%. Here's the critical part of the report, though. Think of the report as a live grenade when it hits the TV or the newspapers. The question now is, what happens? What does a government do with this information? And wow, all across the board. When the El Salvadorian Truth Commission came out and published what happened in the 1980s, and if you study Central America in the 1980s, what unspeakable horrors happened in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, especially, because of civil wars and paramilitary groups, right-wing death squads, typically horrendous. El Salvador government immediately, as soon as the Truth Commission published a report, passed an amnesty law saying, great, thank you for your work, Truth Commission members. Now we're going to pass an amnesty law so none of those folks who were mentioned in the report would ever face justice. Huh. Sometimes the report is used to gather evidence for prosecutions. And in fact, sometimes that's even in the mandate. Publish a report, name names, name as many details as you can, because we will then turn your report over to the judiciary to prosecute offenders. This typically has not happened very well, though. We can look at examples from Uganda, where evidence was used to convict Hisan Habre. I'm sorry, that's Hisan Habre's Chad. But he couldn't be found. He had political asylum, so he was sentenced to death in absentia, but never faced any justice. He died. In Argentina, 5 of the leading military junta members were convicted, but later they were pardoned in 1989 by Carlos Menem. And the military rejected the report's findings completely, so that we weren't responsible for the dirty war. We weren't responsible for disappearances. You have to understand the context. We were fighting against communism. The gloves were off. We had to do what we did to save the republic, though it wasn't a republic. So Argentina, the junta leaders got off. In Uganda, 50 cases were turned over from the truth commissioners to the judiciary. Out of those 50, only 12 convictions, and they were of minor people, because witnesses could not be found to testify, probably because they were threatened with death if they did testify in court. Here's bravery for you. Chile. How many folks have heard of Augusto Pinochet? Okay. Augusto Pinochet took power in a military coup in 1973, ruled until the late 80s. His main weapon was the disappearance. And under his rule, brutal military rule, we don't know how many people disappeared. Thousands disappeared. Again, this is where we need precision but can't, because people disappear. When Pinochet left office, the Chilean legislature made him senator for life. I'll talk about a nice title for a dictator to retire. But then also passed an amnesty law saying Pinochet in particular will not be tried. Now, the Supreme Court of Chile said, well, we got a problem with that. We agree that he certainly can't be tried for murders, because the amnesty law says he can't be tried for murders. It said that it can't be tried, the amnesty law said Pinochet cannot be tried for crimes committed in the past. But the Chilean Supreme Court said, wait a second, disappearances are ongoing crimes. So he could be charged with and held accountable for disappearances, because they're like kidnappings. It's an ongoing crime in progress unless you have a body. So this was one of the leverages used, although Pinochet died before he could actually face trial. This is why Pinochet was returned to Chile to face charges in Chilean courts, but he died before the trial could commence. In a best-case scenario, truth commissions include recommendations. We've studied the past. Here are the details of the past. Here's what should be done to prevent a situation like this from happening in the future. So they might recommend, as South Africa did, paying judges more, increase judicial salaries so they're independent, professionalize the police force so that the police force doesn't represent a government. It doesn't represent a party, a political party. It represents the government. So to include professional education so that police, military know that their enemy is not the people, and they are not servants of a particular political party or ideology. Or, in Zimbabwe, the report's never been released. In 1983, The North Korean trained 5th Brigade of the Zimbabwe military went into southern, called Matabeleland, province of Matabeleland. The only reason why we know really what happened is that the Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace in Zimbabwe, an NGO, interviewed people very soon after the 5th Brigade left Matabeleland. Estimated 20,000 people dead. We don't know how many women were raped. This was genocide as judged by the international community in the last 2 or 3 years, officially categorized as a genocide. The Zimbabwe government did a Truth Commission report back in the early 1990s. We don't know what happened to the report. It's never been publicly released. Fortunately, the Catholic Commission on Justice and Peace did release their report. Another characteristic of Truth Commissions, they are officially created and sanctioned by the state, usually. If you want a phenomenal story of a group of intrepid people with the Catholic Church in Brazil during the military dictatorship, the military, you think of military dictatorships as very efficient. In some cases, they are very efficient. In this case, the generals in charge of Brazil passed a law saying that if an individual wanted, if a lawyer wanted to defend a client who was in jail, they could do that. They could look at one file at a time, and that was it. That was it. So what the Catholic Church in Brazil did, they recruited lawyers to go into various courtrooms and take out one file at a time, take it home, photocopy it, deliver it back about clients, where they were. And they did this hundreds of thousands of times without the military knowing this was a coordinated effort. And so you have the military, which this confounds the imagination. You have these files that contain detailed records of torture committed against a specific defendant. Now, why would you include such a thing? Because the Brazilian military controlled the court system. So who cares if people knew about this? They wouldn't be able to do anything with it. And once this massive effort underneath the noses of the generals, the Catholic Church published Nunca Más, which means never again, a report on torture in Brazil under the generals. This was one reason why the Brazilian government fell in the mid-1980s when this hit the streets. Wow. That's a Truth Commission that wasn't identified with the state, but from the Catholic Church. Normally, they're officially sanctioned and created by the state. They usually operate with public funds. They have access to the media, newspapers, television when the report's released. Finally, very, very importantly, different than a trial, Truth Commissions are victim-centered. Not offender-centered, victim-centered, which means they have a couple characteristics. Instead of forcing victims to travel dozens of miles, hundreds of miles from wherever they live to the capital, to a place they're totally unfamiliar with, the commission travels to them to get their stories in their houses where they're most comfortable sharing details about what happened to them. Now, let's strike one bad example from Chad. The Chad Truth Commission, bless it, didn't have any money. So, I kid you not, they set up their main offices in the building that housed a former torture center and wanted victims to come there to share their stories. Not so victim-centered. The layout of Truth Commissions, and this is what I do in classrooms, too, because I don't want to be the person in front, I'm sorry, here, right, unavoidable, but I have my students go in a circle in desks. That implies equality, right, and it involves we're discussing information, we're sharing information, we're not professor lecturing to students. Same thing with Truth Commissions. The victim, one of the worst things you can do in a trial, right, is put a victim in front of everybody and say, everybody's looking at him or her, tell us what happened to you. So Truth Commission, circular layout of the seats so that there's not one directed focus on the victim who has to be in front of everybody else. Victims are not cross-examined. This is both a strength and a weakness, we'll see in just a sec. So that you tell your story, you don't have a devil's advocate questioning you about your memory. Are you sure this happened to you? Are you sure it was my defendant? Are you absolutely sure? What other evidence can you tell us to prove that you're telling the truth? Right? Talking about damaging to victims. Truth Commissions don't have cross-examination. And then Truth Commissions can offer, whatever the mandate says, direct restitution. I should also say, by the way, that another thing that victims asked for in South Africa was counseling, access to counseling, so that they could get the professional help, doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, who could help them get better given the suffering that they had caused. Now, some disadvantages of truth commissions. There are problems with truth commissions. The South African commission was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, implying that out of truth would come reconciliation. Argentine journalist Horacio Verbitsky said this, quote, "Reconciliation by who? After someone takes away your daughter, tortures her, disappears her, and then denies ever having done it, would you ever want to reconcile with those responsible? That word makes no sense here. The political discourse of reconciliation is profoundly immoral because it denies the reality of what people have experienced. It isn't reasonable to expect someone to reconcile after what happened here." Juan Mendez, who is a former legal counsel to Human Rights Watch in Argentina, said this. He said, "Reconciliation, quote, was a code word for those who wanted nothing done. Reconciliation in Argentina was understood by victims to mean we're being asked to reconcile with our torturers and they're being asked to do nothing." In South Africa, national poll was taken after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report that we, Truth and Reconciliation Commission we see as sort of the best truth commission. Only 17% of South Africans thought that the commission made people more forgiving and at ease with their past. 17%. This is what happens when you set the bar too high. Now, here's a big problem. Let's look at victims for just a sec, or offenders. If victims are not cross-examined in truth commissions, should the report name names? What if people are falsely accused by victims, and now their names are published in a Truth Commission report? This has led to varying standards of whether to name names because of this. In El Salvador and Chad, names are included in the report, but only after a preface reiterated that this did not mean there was a legal determination of guilt. We're just reporting on what victims said, but it may or may not be so. Argentina only included names and quotations by witnesses to enforce the fact that this may or may not be the person actually who is at fault. Some include the names in a confidential appendix only that's not released to the public. Argentina, Chile, Haiti, although Argentina's was leaked to the press anyway. And some, Guatemala, only included positions and descriptions that, to a greater or lesser extent, made it still possible to identify individuals. Stephen Biko. How many folks, is Peter Gabriel still popular with some of y'all? Yeah, okay, 1980s. That's where I come from, right? Peter Gabriel wrote a very famous song called Biko about Stephen Biko, who was killed in South Africa in 1977, a tremendously charismatic anti-apartheid activist. Some victims are very angry at truth commissions. One, because offenders are not punished. And this is the one reason why the South African Commission was very, very criticized. Offenders were given amnesty if they agreed to state what they knew. Now, this, to some victims, was profoundly immoral. Maleti Mxenge, who is the brother of Griffiths Mxenge, who is a human rights lawyer assassinated by the South African secret police, he said, quote, "Some people say that offering amnesty helps the truth come out, but I don't believe that knowing alone makes you happy. Once you know who did it, you want the next best thing. You want justice." Many victims are also angry because they don't feel it serves a deterrent function, especially if the offenders are not held accountable. Bosnian diplomat Sven Alcazar said, quote, "It cannot be stressed enough that the punishment of the guilty and some measure of justice are absolutely necessary for forgiveness or reconciliation even to be considered. If genocide goes unpunished, it will set a precedent for tomorrow's genocide. Without justice, there can never be reconciliation and real peace." And finally, victims are often pressured to move on once they have a Truth Commission report. We have heard you, we have published your information in a report, now it's time to forgive and forget as part of the national reconciliation process. Hector Timmerman, a very famous human rights activist in Argentina, whose father was arrested and tortured, and whose mother had nightmares after his father was disappeared, he said, quote, "I cannot forgive in the name of my parents. Who is authorized to speak for the victims? Not even God can do this." Alex Borain, the deputy chair of the TRC, said, quote, after learning for the first time how her husband died, she was asked if she could forgive the man who did it. Speaking slowly in one of the native languages, her message came back through the interpreters. No government can forgive. No commission can forgive. Only I can forgive. And I am not ready to forgive. So, in terms of a conclusion, Patricia Hayner, in her book about truth commissions, concluded this about truth commissions in general. She said, truth commissions are difficult and controversial entities. They are given a mammoth, almost impossible task, and usually insufficient time and resources to complete it. They must struggle with rampant lies, denials, and deceit, and the painful, almost unspeakable memories of victims to uncover still dangerous truths that many in power may well continue to resist. So, in terms of a conclusion, well, if we looked at those 5 characteristics at the beginning that mark failing states, accountability can go a long way, whether through trials, truth commissions, to restore the characteristics of a functioning state. So that once a government establishes a truth commission or trials, a legitimate process to hold past offenders accountable, you have the possibility of the leaders in power, whether they be democracies or dictatorships in the short term, able to deliver political goods because they're seen as legitimate, so the population gives them a chance to do what governments give to their peoples that we take for granted in a peaceful state. To allow for a judicial system, to allow roads and sanitation and infrastructure to grow. Security forces, by learning from past mistakes published in trials or truth commissions, can hopefully learn how to act within the law as professionals, serving the public rather than oppressing the public. This peace and stability then can lead to a roadmap toward democratization. There's a big leap of faith here. I teach a course on nation building at Norwich. Nation building is just about an impossible task. I've come to the conclusion. Just about. There's room for some hope in some situations. But in terms of occupying a foreign country against their will and force-feeding them what you want them to do is a recipe for failure. And we're learning that. We should have learned it in Cuba in 1898, if we were good historians, with the occupation of Cuba after the Spanish-American War. If you're interested in nation building, there's Exhibit A of American good intentions misapplied. There are certainly other occasions where we should have learned. We do have some success stories. Japan and Germany after World War II. We take best practices and then forget them. We're good at that. There should be more there should be more historians in positions of power. But maybe we'd be too arrogant by thinking we know everything. So maybe that's a bad idea. This peace can allow for economic development, can lead to the political stability necessary for foreign investment and for the formation and sustenance of a formal economy with citizens, small businesses, farmers, being able to determine their own economic destinies. And finally, if reconciliation does occur, have the chance to occur, people can begin to see what they have in common and create a national identity rather than clinging to primary allegiances to subnational groups that fuel the conflict. So thank you. You all have been very patient with me. Thank you very much. Thank you. I welcome comments and questions. Sir, if you could tell me your name.
I'm Nick.
Nick.
Yeah. I was really curious. You know, in recent news, there's been a lot of political debate around the issue between Turkey and Armenia, and the new law in Turkey, where they do not even mention the word genocide, and to mention the word is against the law.
Yes.
And the French president has decided that he will use it, and the government of Turkey has decided to cut ties with France.
Yes.
And of course, this is a bit of a hot potato debate whether to recognize the Armenian genocide or to continue our relationship with the regional superpower of Turkey. What are your thoughts on this issue, sir?
That's an excellent question. Excellent question. You know, it'd be helpful to know what first of all, the Turkish government perceives of what happened in Armenia, and their position is not that any crimes were committed. We just can't call it genocide. Their position is that it was in the context of a civil war, that Armenians were a suspect people whose loyalty was to the Ottoman Empire, and therefore they were a national security threat. They were armed against us. We had to act for our own self-defense, since Turkey was a new nation emerging from the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, we were justified in doing what we had to do. That's their view. It's not like they say, well, yes, we're really sorry for what we did to the Armenians. My personal view, calling things is naming them. Naming them is very important. Denying what happened to the Armenians in Turkey by not calling it genocide causes it to be something less than what happened. And that is censoring history. That is immoral to the surviving victims today, and that Turkey has to understand that if other nations are willing to call it genocide, that could lead to leverage among Turkish scholars themselves to say, yes, we agree, and that could then be a two-front, joint front for the government of Turkey to back down on its hardline stance. The U.S. House of Representatives called it genocide in the 1980s, and the Reagan administration said, no, we can't, because Turkey was a Cold War partner, a NATO member. So put the kibosh on it so the Senate would not approve it. Words are important. If we were to say to a woman, you were not raped, you were mistreated, that's a very important distinction and a profoundly immoral one. That's the same analogy I would make to Turkey by not calling it genocide. And have you read accounts of the Armenian genocide by any?
Well, I mean, I have read some, but the way you try and look at it from both ways, and from a Turkish perspective as well, and they deny it so vehemently that it's almost as if you do get a feeling that, well, a little bit of doubt in your mind that, well, maybe it's not completely accurate, or that there is something more to the entire event itself. So you do have issues of doubt because of the competing ideas about it.
Yeah.
So,
if you want to have some good money for quote, genocide scholarship, go to the government of Turkey as an American scholar and say, I agree with your party line, I want to publish a book. They'll give you money. They have set up institutes of research to exactly disseminate this particular political opinion. One of the fascinating parts of this narrative, who's on the ground in Armenia in 1918, 1919, reporting to the U.S. government on what's going on? Henry Morgenthau, future Secretary of the Treasury, who's Jewish, who knows about persecution. He's on the ground there. He's attached to the American embassy, and he sees the columns of refugees. He sees people being beaten on the streets in front of him and killed. And he writes heart-rending dispatches back to Washington, D.C., to Woodrow Wilson, saying, we need to intervene here. We need to open a second front here. And, you know, Wilson's not interested, because his focus is on Western Europe and Germany. And certainly after the British disaster at Gallipoli? Yeah. Yes, Gallipoli. Thank you. Yes. The United States was even less interested in that. So, but that's a very good question. Yeah, very contemporary, relevant. Tell me your name.
My name is Marielle.
Marielle.
And one thing that I know is kind of a growing trend in terms of injustice is using child soldiers.
Yeah.
And in cases like in Uganda with the LRA and using child soldiers, what do you think would be the best solution for peace in the country? Is it, you know, because you do have these cases where, you know, yes, we're taking the 10, you're now 18. Like, how would you recommend? if you had an opinion on that.
Using child soldiers is one of those insidious ways of destroying your country, right? Because you're exposing youth and using them to commit violence. They're the future of your country. They're the men and women who are supposed to grow up and take the reins of power and responsibility. Liberia has been an incredible example of providing. First of all, first thing you have to do with child soldiers is disarm them. You need to take the weapons away. Then you need to re-educate them in a profoundly different worldview than what they've been exposed to. But in a way that doesn't kill them by making them so guilty for what they've done. Liberia has had an incredible use of indigenous healing ceremonies. And here's where, Western medicine may not be the way to go, psychotherapy, where child soldiers are, and I don't know the detail, I would have to do more research to be more specific, but they go through a purification ceremony. Kind of like, I don't want to, no, I shouldn't make that metaphor. I don't want it to be misunderstood. But in a way that allows you to emerge as a new person spiritually. And that becomes then the growth point to reintegration into society as an equal member. So some sort of purification ceremony by which individuals can be not, you have to be careful with accountability because they are children, right, on the one hand. And our law recognizes that minors under the age of 18 can't be held accountable for their actions. You do want to hold them accountable because you want them to understand that what they did was wrong. But at the same time, give them a chance through these indigenous ceremonies to then emerge as something else. Very good question, because especially in West Africa, as you mentioned, in general, with the LRA and other groups.
I believe that Russia has great difficulty making the transition to a Western type of democracy. And I believe that one of the issues is that they have never come to terms with the horrific past of the Gulag and all those millions of people that died and suffered and everything. And what can they do to? I understand that there is some attempt to. One group, an NGO, is publishing the names of people that were victimized during the Soviet Union. But what can they do to try to bridge that gap? Because they do have to come to terms with their past at some point.
Yeah.
And the longer they wait, of course, most of the people that perpetrated that are dead.
Right. One of the unspoken heroes of the whole Glasnost Perestroika era was a group called Memorial. You may be familiar with Memorial. These are a Russian NGO that sought to, especially survivors of labor camps who joined, to open the Russian archives, the brief period of time, late 80s, early 90s, to uncover as much information about Stalin's archipelago of secret prisons and detention centers. That was then shut down, especially when Putin became prime minister. You're absolutely right, and this is why it's very important to call things what they are and to uncover the past, because that has a profound effect on people in the present. We can argue about countries are different in terms of democracy. And I tell my folks in nation building, let's define what the characteristics of a democracy are so we know exactly what countries might be more or less democratic and what might not be. You're right, Russia's by no means democratic. There was a period where they were a lot more democratic than they are today. There needs to be, as you mentioned, before time passes, some sort of uncovery of this information. How best to do that, I can't be prepared to say. I'm not sure what would work. It has to be done by Russians themselves. And it's got to be done in a way that somehow they get because Stalin's secret police, KGB, kept detailed files, like the dictators in Brazil. The files are there. They haven't been destroyed as far as we know. So I guess my answer to your question is, I don't have a clue.
Well, it seems there's something like the Memorial NGO that you mentioned.
Yeah.
That would be a step in the right direction.
Absolutely.
If they got more government support and everything.
Yeah, and perhaps the first step, actually, and this is what I say in nation building. Sometimes this gets to amnesty and impunity. So you have to postpone amnesty and impunity until you have economic reconstruction, until people have a sense of safety for their own personal security and a measure of economic security. And once people do that, once they know that their next meal, where their next meal is coming from, they have jobs, then they can focus on political reconciliation, political accounting for the past. This is what destroyed Memorial. When hyperinflation hit Russia in the early 90s because of the oligarchs and the crash course to capitalism, which should have never happened, in hindsight, right? It's easier to say in hindsight. If the Russian economy becomes stabilized, I think you'd have a lot more people willing to confront the past. But those voices are drowned out because of unemployment, alcoholism, drug abuse, the war in Chechnya. We can come up with other issues, social issues. Until those are solved, that would be the starting point, perhaps.
Well, we have time for one or two more questions.
Oh, okay. Your first name?
Avital.
Avital.
I had a few semesters ago wrote a paper on like a lot of the war crime related stuff on Yugoslavia.
Oh.
But at the end of the paper, I really kind of still didn't feel a resolve of really what the end really was. I just felt that there was a lot of still finger pointing at different, sub countries. Has there been a real resolve, or?
Here's where, did you, in your paper, did you cover the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at all?
Yeah, the class was on the UN.
Ah, yes.
So it was very encompassing of everything.
Here's, the international community basically said that once we have Slobodan Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic, who's still in The Hague right now, his trial's ongoing, we finally captured him, but we didn't know where he was. Well, of course we knew where he was, but it took many years for the Serb government to hand him over. If we try the top folks in front of a UN tribunal, then that'll lead to reconciliation. But it doesn't happen, because if you're a victim of human rights abuse, Slobodan Milosevic is not the person who tortured you. He's not the person who disappeared your loved one. And so you want to hold the lower level folks accountable. That hasn't been done. And as a result, while the Dayton Peace Accords, and Richard Holbrooke, who recently passed away, boy, what a brilliant diplomat, one of the unsung heroes of American diplomacy, not just for Dayton, but what he did afterwards. There was peace in the Balkans. That was the time to do lower-level reconciliation. Some Western NGOs and some NGOs in Bosnia, in Republika Srpska, formed just to do that, to try to bring some measure of, not necessarily accountability because they were NGOs, but to discover what happened, sort of like informal truth commissions. But the leaders of those countries did not agree with any kind of reconciliation or uncovering of the past. The Bosnian government didn't want to investigate relatively lower numbers of crimes it did, and certainly the Serbian and Croat governments had no interest, especially since the folks who committed the ethnic cleansing were still in charge after Dayton, right? Tudjman in Croatia and Milosevic for several years after in Serbia. So unless you have the higher level folks held accountable and removed from office, and lower level police, security agents held accountable through a transitional government, through a new government, you're not going to have that kind of reconciliation. And as a result, you have basically the ratification of ethnic cleansing today in the Balkans. You have who won in the Balkans? Milosevic did. You've got ethnically pure states created. And so there's no talk of forming again a confederation of Yugoslavia. So the time may have been past for that. And you have, now I forget the Djindjic, Zoran Djindjic, who was a very brave prime minister very briefly in Serbia, who talked about reconciliation for the past, and for his trouble he was assassinated. So this may be a place where, unlike Russia, where there still might be hope if you get the economy under control, because you still have people alive who were victims of abuses and who could perhaps do a critical mass. In the Balkans, you still have states separated along ethnic lines. So the future doesn't look very good for that. One more? Your first name?
Nils.
Nils.
Yes. Has there ever been an example of a truth commission held by, say, a third party, something like the UN? Because certainly, unless there was a revolution or some kind of upheaval where a government was being ended and they were trying to either confront past horrors, or unless there was some political motivation, there would be really there would be no use of a truth commission, politically speaking. Is there ever been an example of like the UN, say, investigating a truth commission?
Not a UN sponsor. Now, the UN has given aid to other truth commissions, funds, to allow them to operate. Typically, especially in places like Chad, Sierra Leone, operating with UN funds. But not a UN truth commission. There have, though, been hybrid UN national courts set up. Cambodia is a very unwieldy example of that. Boy, talk about a very interesting partnership. Here's the United Nations. Here's the Cambodian government that doesn't want to do anything but needs to be on board because it's the political will of the international community that it hold trials for Pol Pot and other former officials. So this is like a really bad marriage. You have the UN saying you must do something. The Cambodian government for years said, yeah, we'll get to it, we'll get to it, we'll get to it. Finally, some of you may have read, just last year they held a guy by the name of, was it named Duke? Dutch, thanks. Dutch, who was one of the main torturers at Tuol Sleng prison in Cambodia, finally held him accountable. Pol Pot died, though, without ever seeing justice because the Cambodian government, through its own passive-aggressive ways, prevented the UN from setting up this hybrid court. It now exists. A more successful example, UN Sierra Leone National Court. That functioned very well, but that's a court, not a truth commission. Yeah. So the only thing the UN's done in terms of truth commissions is giving financial aid and technical expertise as well. We'll give you computers, we'll give you office staff, we'll train your office staff, we'll train judges, train prosecutors, or train truth commission members, I should say. But yeah, no actually formal UN ownership of the truth commission, which is probably just as well, because if there's a political will to create a truth commission, you don't want it to be discredited by enemies of the Truth Commission saying it's really a UN body forced on us. So by limiting the UN's role, it might actually be better.
Keep them non-biased and not getting involved in individual political agendas.
Exactly. Right. Give them the money, but you set up your Truth Commission as you would like to with your own members. Right. Yeah, for legitimacy. Can we take one more? Okay. Sir.
I'm interested in the Rome Statute of the Criminal Court.
Yes.
What do you see as the future of that vis-a-vis the U.S.?
The book that Peter mentioned that I'm writing covers the period 1941 to 1950. The United States supports the Atlantic Charter, the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention, except when it might be used against the United States. So one of the fascinating stories is how even the Genocide Convention, the United States could not sign the Genocide Convention without making sure that it would not be held accountable in any international body for genocide against African Americans in the South, because this was still the age of segregation and Jim Crow. So fascinating work by W. E. Du Bois on this as well. Same principle applies to the Rome Statute, right? That Clinton signs it with the idea that he's not sending it to the Senate because the Senate's going to reject it because it might apply to American peacekeepers. Even though retired members of the U.S. military said, no, it won't apply because American soldiers don't commit war crimes, crimes against humanity. These are systemic crimes, right? Ordinary soldiers of any country are not going to be tried by the International Criminal Court. It's designed to try higher-level military officials and civilian officials. And then President Bush, second President Bush, did something that doesn't even exist in international law. He unsigned it. You know, it's like President Clinton signed it with a pencil, and George Bush said, well, I'm going to erase that, so he never signed it. That's a real feat. I don't know if that even be identified in international law for the same reason. Short term, it's in America's interest to sign it. But the problem is that you get grandstanding by, and I don't want to be politicized, but by conservatives who argue that this is a threat to American national security because we can't trust the UN with anything because they're out to get the United States and presidents and so forth. Now, it doesn't help in this debate that there are some real American officials who could be tried and perhaps should be tried for war crimes. And I'm not, I work at Norwich. I work at a military institution. I get in trouble sometimes for saying things like this. But this is exactly what needs to be said, that Henry Kissinger should face arrest Donald Rumsfeld should face arrest and trial. I'm not saying he's guilty or innocent, but he deserves to be tried and evidence exposed for what happened in Abu Ghraib, what happened in Iraq. Torture is torture. It doesn't matter if John Yoo comes up with a memo and says, no, torture only means if you're about to kill somebody by bodily organ failure. That's his own definition. Torture has a specific meaning in international law. But to get back to your question, I don't see it politically viable in the short term because you have people giving worst-case scenarios. This is why the U.S. has hardly ratified any international human rights agreements, because you can always come up with lawyers' arguments. Are you going to law school, by the way? Oh, okay. Well, I mean, lawyers are good people. I work with good lawyers. But lawyers are paid to come up with worst-case scenarios and hypotheticals to scare you into not doing what might otherwise be in your best interest. That's their job. I mean, they're not good or bad people. That's their job, to protect you. So there are enough lawyers in the State Department and Defense Department to raise hypothetical situations that will not in the real world ever apply. And if they did apply, they wouldn't apply just to the United States. They would apply to every other country that signed the Rome Statute, who knew that these hypotheticals existed. So we've got to balance the legal technicalities versus the diplomatic and political importance of the Rome Statute. And I think the Rome Statute has more than proven its worth with the trials in The Hague under the Rome Statute of Slobodan Milosevic and other people, including whenever the president of Sudan will be sometime arrested, right? He's already under indictment, arrested and tried before that too. So politically, it may not be viable, but boy, it's something that a lot of us are working very hard on. And I encourage you all, let me just say one more thing. I'm sorry, but in the back, if any of you all want to take action on a specific happening in Zimbabwe, I'm a member of Amnesty International. I put on the back table, Jeff's holding it up, on urgent action. The governor Mugabe is trying to ban 29 non-governmental organizations in one of the provinces. And the fear is that as Zimbabwe moves toward elections on its constitution and elections for president and parliament, perhaps next year, the date hasn't been set, that this banning of NGOs from provinces is designed to give Mugabe cover to commit violence against the population who he perceives as his political enemies. NGOs are very important on the ground because they are the eyes and ears of the external community. That's how we get news. And if they're banned, that allows for potentially war crimes, crimes against humanity to be committed in Zimbabwe. So if you can take a copy if you leave, there's addresses to write to. You can have Mugabe as your pen pal if you'd like. He doesn't return my mail, but maybe you'll be luckier. But it's important that he know that the international community knows. You may think your letter doesn't make a difference. It does, because dictators thrive on people not knowing what they're doing. So you do have the power. The power of the pen can be powerful. Thank you very much. Safe drive to you all tonight if you have to, or safe walking. Thank you. Thank you.